Let's take a moment to slow things down and look at how this part of history actually unfolded. Let's walk through it. In 1944, World War II is commonly remembered as a conflict approaching its conclusion, defined in popular memory by Allied advances, collapsing Axis defenses, and an apparent inevitability of victory. The war is often summarized as having been effectively decided before its final year began. This documentary instead examines why, despite that perception, the last months of the war proved among its most lethal. Understanding this period matters because nearly a third of all wartime casualties occurred after many military leaders privately accepted that the outcome was no longer in doubt. The persistence of mass death was not accidental, but the result of strategic choices, institutional inertia, and the structural logic of total war. Before we continue, consider liking the video and subscribing if you value serious, carefully researched historical documentaries. By late summer 1944, Allied forces had landed in Western Europe and broken out of Normandy, while Axis armies were retreating on multiple fronts. A confirmed historical fact is that Germany lost more soldiers between September 1944 and May 1945 than in any equivalent earlier period of the war. Yet surrender did not follow. One lesser-known operational detail is that Allied planners deliberately rejected negotiated capitulation in favor of unconditional surrender, a policy formally articulated earlier but rigidly enforced in the war's final phase. This decision shaped battlefield behavior by removing incentives for partial ceasefires or localized truces. Command structures further contributed to the continued bloodshed. Leaders such as Dwight D. Eisenhower prioritized rapid continuous pressure to prevent enemy regrouping, even when it meant advancing into heavily defended terrain. On the opposing side, fragmented authority allowed regional commanders to continue fighting independently after strategic coherence had collapsed. Historians continue to debate whether the cumulative death toll of the final months was an unavoidable consequence of total war or the product of political and doctrinal rigidity on all sides. What is clear is that the final phase of World War II cannot be understood as a simple aftermath. It was a distinct period in which military institutions, ideological commitments, and civilian vulnerability combined to produce extraordinary levels of violence after the war's outcome was already decided. The sections that follow analyze how and why that happened. By late 1944, the prevailing public narrative in Allied countries suggested that World War II was approaching a rapid and relatively orderly conclusion. Newspaper headlines emphasized advances, liberated cities, and the apparent disintegration of Axis power. This created what many contemporaries described as an illusion of inevitable victory, the belief that remaining fighting would be limited, brief, and comparatively less deadly. In reality, the opposite occurred. Combat intensity increased, and casualty rates in several theaters reached their highest levels of the entire war. A confirmed historical fact is that Allied armies in Western Europe suffered some of their highest monthly losses between October 1944 and March 1945. One lesser-known operational detail is that this surge was partly driven by optimistic planning assumptions. Military staffs frequently underestimated enemy resilience, leading to offensives launched without adequate reserves or rest cycles. These miscalculations produced prolonged engagements that ground forward momentum into costly attrition. Political leadership reinforced this mindset. Public statements by figures such as Winston Churchill stressed confidence and inevitability, partly to sustain civilian morale and wartime production. While effective at home, this rhetoric obscured the operational reality faced by frontline units. Soldiers were often told that a final push would end the war, only to encounter reinforced defensive lines, poor weather, and stubborn resistance that prolonged fighting for months. The illusion of imminent victory also affected command decisions. Senior officers were less inclined to pause operations for regrouping, fearing that any delay might allow the enemy to stabilize. As a result, offensives continued through winter conditions that sharply increased non-combat casualties from exposure, disease, and exhaustion. These losses rarely appeared in official communiques, but contributed significantly to the overall death toll. Historians continue to debate whether the belief in inevitable victory shortened the war by sustaining pressure or paradoxically extended it by encouraging overly ambitious operations. What is not in dispute is that expectations shape behavior. When leaders, soldiers, and civilians alike assumed the end was near, they were often unprepared for the scale and duration of violence that followed. The gap between perception and reality in late 1944 helps explain why the war's final months were not a denouement, but one of its deadliest chapters. Victory may have been assured, but it was neither quick nor merciful. The persistence of mass casualties in the final months of World War II cannot be understood without examining how senior command decisions were shaped by the logic of total war. By late 1944, military institutions on all sides had been mobilized for absolute victory, leaving little room for compromise or operational restraint. Total war doctrine framed the conflict not as a contest to be managed, but as one to be resolved conclusively, regardless of cost. A confirmed historical fact is that no major belligerent formally revised its strategic objectives downward during the war's final phase. Instead, commands intensified efforts to destroy enemy forces outright. One lesser-known operational detail is that internal memoranda within several high commands acknowledged rising casualty projections, yet concluded that continued offensives were preferable to any pause that might complicate post-war settlement or occupation. In this environment, minimizing losses became secondary to achieving irreversible military outcomes. On the Axis side, command authority became increasingly centralized and rigid. Adolf Hitler routinely overruled field commanders, forbidding withdrawals even when encirclement was imminent. These orders transformed tactical defeats into annihilations, dramatically increasing fatalities among units that might otherwise have disengaged. Local officers often recognized the futility of continued resistance, but lacked the authority to act independently. Allied command structures, while more flexible, were also driven by institutional imperatives. Maintaining coalition cohesion required visible momentum, encouraging continuous, large-scale operations. One operational consequence was the prioritization of speed over consolidation, leading to extended supply lines and exposed formations. When counterattacks occurred, these vulnerabilities translated directly into higher casualties. The machinery of war, once set in motion, proved difficult to slow without risking strategic or political consequences. Historians continue to debate whether these command decisions reflected rational calculations or an inability to adapt doctrines developed earlier in the war. Some argue that relentless pressure prevented prolonged insurgency or fragmented resistance after formal defeat. Others contend that institutional momentum and fear of appearing indecisive locked commanders into patterns of action that needlessly prolonged suffering. What emerges clearly is that total war narrowed the range of acceptable choices. In the final months, leaders were not merely fighting remaining battles. They were executing systems designed for maximum force application. The result was a continuation of lethal operations, even when strategic victory was no longer in question. The Battle of the Bulge stands as the most dramatic illustration of why the final months of World War II remained so deadly. Launched in December 1944, this offensive represented Germany's last major attempt to alter the strategic balance in Western Europe. Rather than a symbolic gesture, it was a fully resourced operation that inflicted severe casualties and prolonged large-scale combat well into the winter. A confirmed historical fact is that the German offensive achieved complete tactical surprise, penetrating deeply into Allied lines and temporarily disrupting command and supply networks. In its opening days, several Allied divisions were overrun or isolated, resulting in thousands of casualties and prisoners. One lesser-known operational detail is that poor weather initially grounded Allied air power, neutralizing one of the Allies' most decisive advantages and allowing ground fighting to escalate without aerial mitigation. The offensive was shaped by unrealistic strategic assumptions at the highest level. Adolf Hitler believed that a concentrated blow through the Ardennes could fracture the Allied coalition by capturing key logistical hubs and forcing a negotiated peace in the West. Field commanders, many of whom doubted the plan's feasibility, were nonetheless ordered to execute it with absolute commitment. This rigidity ensured that once the offensive stalled, retreat was delayed, converting failed advances into costly defensive battles. For the Allies, the battle shattered assumptions about imminent victory. Emergency redeployments rushed units into combat with minimal preparation. One operational consequence was the heavy reliance on infantry to hold ground under extreme winter conditions, producing high rates of frostbite, exposure, and fatigue-related deaths alongside combat losses. Medical evacuation was frequently delayed, increasing mortality among the wounded. Historians continue to debate whether the Battle of the Bulge meaningfully delayed the end of the war or merely concentrated inevitable losses into a shorter period. What is clear is that the offensive consumed vast numbers of lives at a moment when Germany lacked any realistic path to victory. Its significance lies not in strategic success, but in demonstrating how desperation, miscalculation, and doctrinal inflexibility combined to make the war's closing phase extraordinarily lethal. The battle underscored a central reality of late 1944. Even a collapsing power could still impose catastrophic costs, and victory, however assured, remained violently contested. As World War II entered its final phase, combat increasingly shifted from open maneuver warfare into dense urban environments. This transition dramatically increased civilian exposure to violence and amplified the overall lethality of the conflict. Cities became focal points not only for military control, but also for symbolic and administrative authority, ensuring that they were defended and attacked with exceptional intensity. A confirmed historical fact is that, by early 1945, a majority of major engagements in Europe involved fighting in or around populated urban areas. One lesser-known operational detail is that many cities lacked functioning civil defense by this stage of the war. Air raid shelters were overcrowded or destroyed, water and sanitation systems had collapsed, and municipal administrations often ceased to function before fighting ended. As a result, civilians were frequently trapped in active combat zones with no organized means of evacuation. Urban warfare imposed severe tactical constraints on attacking forces. Streets, factories, and residential blocks favored defenders and required methodical clearing operations. Artillery and aerial bombardment were routinely used to reduce resistance, but these methods caused extensive collateral damage. Entire neighborhoods were leveled to eliminate isolated strongpoints, producing civilian casualty levels disproportionate to the number of defenders engaged. In some cities, fires caused more deaths than direct combat, as emergency services were unable to respond. For defending forces, urban combat encouraged prolonged resistance even when strategic withdrawal might have preserved manpower. Local commanders often believed that holding cities would delay the enemy and improve negotiating leverage. In practice, this resulted in encirclements that destroyed both military units and civilian populations. Historians continue to debate whether urban resistance meaningfully slowed Allied advances or simply transformed inevitable defeat into humanitarian catastrophe. Civilians faced impossible choices. Remaining at home risked bombardment, while attempting to flee exposed families to strafing, exposure, and shortages. One documented pattern was the rise in deaths from disease and malnutrition during urban sieges. Conditions rarely reflected in immediate battle casualty figures, but central to the final death toll. The shift to urban warfare ensured that the boundary between front line and home front effectively disappeared. In the war's final months, cities were no longer merely objectives. They became environments where military necessity and civilian survival collided, contributing decisively to the extraordinary human cost of the conflict's end. Air power reached its peak destructive capacity during the final months of World War II, contributing significantly to the war's continued lethality, even as ground resistance weakened. Strategic bombing campaigns developed earlier in the conflict were not scaled back as victory approached. Instead, they intensified, driven by the belief that overwhelming air assault could accelerate collapse and reduce the need for prolonged ground fighting. A confirmed historical fact is that the highest tonnage of bombs dropped in Europe occurred between late 1944 and the spring of 1945. Industrial centers, transportation hubs, and urban districts were subjected to repeated large-scale raids. One lesser-known operational detail is that many bombing missions in this period targeted already damaged cities, not because of immediate military necessity, but to paralyze repair efforts and overwhelm civil administration. Rail yards were struck repeatedly to prevent even minimal restoration of logistics, trapping both military units and civilians in devastated areas. Air commanders argued that sustained bombardment shortened the war by destroying the enemy's capacity to coordinate resistance. Figures such as Arthur Harris maintained that continued pressure was essential until surrender was secured beyond reversal. This doctrine left little room for selective targeting or humanitarian consideration once campaigns were underway. As a result, air operations continued at full scale, even when ground advances had already rendered many targets strategically redundant. For civilians, the consequences were severe. Air raids disrupted food distribution, medical services, and emergency response, sharply increasing indirect mortality. Fires ignited by bombing frequently burned unchecked for days due to the absence of water pressure and firefighting equipment. In several cities, deaths from smoke inhalation and exposure exceeded those caused by blast injuries, an outcome rarely anticipated in pre-war planning models. Historians continue to debate whether late-war bombing materially hastened surrender or primarily compounded destruction already assured by ground advances. Some argue that air power prevented organized retreat and regrouping, reducing long-term resistance. Others contend that by the final months, bombing campaigns functioned more as instruments of doctrinal momentum than strategic necessity. What is beyond dispute is that air power ensured the war did not taper off gradually. From the air, the final phase of World War II was fought with maximum intensity, reinforcing a pattern in which technological capacity and institutional commitment sustained mass death even as defeat became unavoidable. As the war entered its final months, the collapse of logistics systems became a decisive factor in sustaining high mortality rates. Modern industrial warfare depended on continuous flows of food, fuel, ammunition, and medical supplies. By late 1944, these systems were under extreme strain across much of Europe, transforming shortages into lethal conditions that affected soldiers and civilians alike. A confirmed historical fact is that transportation infrastructure across Central Europe was operating at a fraction of its pre-war capacity by early 1945. Rail networks were repeatedly disrupted by bombing, rolling stock was destroyed faster than it could be replaced, and fuel shortages immobilized vehicles even where tracks remained intact. One lesser-known operational detail is that many frontline units received ammunition before food or medical supplies, a prioritization that preserved combat capability while sharply increasing deaths from untreated wounds, infection, and starvation. For soldiers, logistical failure directly translated into vulnerability. Units often advanced faster than supply columns could follow, particularly during winter operations. Rations were cut, winter clothing was insufficient, and wounded personnel waited hours or days for evacuation. Exposure became a significant killer. In some formations, non-combat losses rivaled those from direct enemy action, a reality rarely acknowledged in official casualty reporting at the time. Civilians suffered even more acutely. Urban populations depended on centralized distribution systems that ceased functioning under sustained bombardment and retreat. Food shortages were compounded by the destruction of storage facilities and the requisitioning of remaining supplies for military use. One documented pattern was the rise of mortality from preventable illnesses as hospitals lacked electricity, clean water, and basic medicines. These deaths accumulated quietly, outside the visibility of battlefield statistics. Commanders were aware of these conditions, but often considered them unavoidable. Maintaining operational tempo took precedence over stabilizing rear areas. Historians continue to debate whether logistical collapse was an unintended byproduct of aggressive strategy or an accepted cost within a framework that valued decisive military outcomes above humanitarian considerations. What is clear is that the breakdown of logistics ensured that even periods of reduced combat remained deadly. Hunger, cold, and disease extended the war's killing power beyond the battlefield. In the final months of World War II, suffering was not limited to moments of combat, it became embedded in the basic conditions of daily survival. As military defeat became increasingly evident, state authorities enforced continued resistance through discipline, coercion, and punishment. In the final months of World War II, the maintenance of internal control became as important to collapsing regimes as resisting the enemy itself. This dynamic ensured that fighting continued even when military logic no longer supported it. A confirmed historical fact is that desertion and unauthorized retreat were met with severe penalties in late 1944 and early 1945, including summary execution in some cases. Special military courts operated near the front, and sentences were often carried out immediately. One lesser-known operational detail is that hastily organized security units were deployed behind front lines not to fight the enemy, but to prevent withdrawals and enforce compliance. These units rarely influence battlefield outcomes, but they significantly increase the human cost by trapping soldiers in untenable positions. Discipline was reinforced through ideological messaging that framed surrender as betrayal rather than survival. Propaganda emphasized duty to the state and portrayed continued resistance as a moral obligation regardless of circumstances. This messaging filtered down to local commanders, many of whom feared post-war accountability or internal punishment more than military defeat. As a result, defensive positions were held long after they had lost strategic value. Civilians were also affected by enforced resistance. Authorities ordered evacuations or prohibitions on flight that exposed populations to combat and bombardment. In some areas, men and boys were compelled into ad hoc defensive formations with minimal training and equipment. Historians continue to debate whether these measures reflected genuine belief in reversal or a deliberate attempt to delay defeat at any human cost. For opposing forces, enforced resistance eliminated opportunities for negotiated surrender at the local level. Units that might otherwise have capitulated continued fighting until destroyed or overrun. This hardened combat dynamics, increasing casualties on both sides and prolonging engagements that offered no realistic military advantage. The enforcement of resistance demonstrates that the war's final months were shaped not only by external pressure, but by internal control mechanisms that prioritized authority over preservation of life. Discipline, once a tool for military effectiveness, became a mechanism that sustained killing long after strategic defeat was inevitable. Ideology played a central role in prolonging combat during the final months of World War II. Even as military defeat became unavoidable, ideological commitments shaped decision-making at every level, discouraging surrender and legitimizing continued sacrifice. The war was not framed merely as a contest of armies, but as an existential struggle in which compromise equated to annihilation. A confirmed historical fact is that official directives issued in late 1944 explicitly linked military resistance to ideological survival, asserting that defeat would result in national destruction. These messages were disseminated through military channels, schools, and civil organizations. One lesser-known operational detail is that ideological officers embedded within units were tasked with monitoring morale and reporting defeatist attitudes, further narrowing the space for pragmatic decision-making by frontline commanders. This ideological rigidity distorted strategic judgment. Rather than adapting to deteriorating conditions, leaders interpreted setbacks as evidence that greater sacrifice was required. Defensive battles were framed as moral tests rather than military calculations. This perspective encouraged last-stand engagements that inflicted heavy casualties without altering the strategic balance. In several cases, units fought until they were annihilated, despite having opportunities to disengage or surrender. For civilians, ideology justified continued exposure to danger. Urban populations were urged to endure bombardment and shortages in the name of collective destiny. Evacuation or flight was sometimes portrayed as cowardice, discouraging timely movement away from combat zones. Historians continue to debate whether ideological indoctrination genuinely sustained resistance or whether fear of punishment and social pressure were more decisive factors in maintaining compliance. Opposing forces were also influenced by ideological framing. Enemy combatants were frequently portrayed as irreconcilable adversaries, reducing willingness to accept surrender and increasing the likelihood of destructive final engagements. Mutual dehumanization hardened attitudes on both sides, ensuring that battles were fought to exhaustion rather than resolved through negotiation. In the final analysis, ideology transformed defeat into a condition to be resisted rather than managed. By redefining survival itself as contingent on continued fighting, ideological commitments ensured that the war's closing phase remained intensely violent. Long after strategic logic favored cessation, belief systems sustained a pattern of combat that made the final months among the deadliest of the entire conflict. The treatment of prisoners of war deteriorated sharply during the final months of World War II, reflecting the broader collapse of institutional control and humanitarian norms. As front lines shifted rapidly and resources vanished, systems designed to manage captives ceased to function effectively, turning imprisonment itself into a deadly condition. A confirmed historical fact is that mortality rates among prisoners of war rose significantly in late 1944 and early 1945 compared to earlier phases of the conflict. Camps became overcrowded as retreats forced the consolidation of prisoners into fewer facilities. One lesser-known operational detail is that forced evacuations of camps, often conducted on foot during winter, exposed prisoners to extreme cold, starvation, and violence. These movements were not centrally planned evacuations, but improvised marches ordered by local authorities seeking to prevent liberation of captives. Legal protections existed in theory. The Geneva Convention established standards for the treatment of prisoners, including access to food, medical care, and protection from violence. In practice, adherence to these provisions collapsed as supply systems failed and command authority fragmented. Camp guards frequently lacked orders, rations, or transport, leading to ad hoc decisions that placed survival burdens on prisoners themselves. As conditions worsened, brutality increased. Guards facing their own shortages often prioritized their survival over prisoner welfare. Disease spread rapidly in camps where sanitation had broken down, and medical care was minimal or non-existent. In some instances, prisoners were abandoned during retreats, left without food or shelter in active combat zones. These deaths rarely appeared in operational casualty figures, but contributed substantially to the war's final human toll. Historians continue to debate whether the spike in prisoner deaths resulted primarily from deliberate cruelty or from systemic collapse beyond the control of individuals on the ground. While intent varied, the outcome was consistent. Captivity in the war's final phase became exceptionally lethal. The fate of prisoners of war underscores a broader pattern of late-war brutality. As institutions disintegrated, protections dependent on structure and accountability vanished. In this environment, survival often depended less on legal status than on circumstance, reinforcing why the final months of World War II were marked by extreme and often hidden forms of mass death. The final months of World War II were marked by vast civilian displacement that produced mortality on a scale comparable to major military operations. As front lines shifted rapidly and urban centers became battlegrounds, millions of civilians were forced onto roads, rail lines, and improvised routes with little preparation or support. These movements were not orderly evacuations, but chaotic flights driven by fear, rumor, and collapsing authority. A confirmed historical fact is that by early 1945, civilian refugee flows across Central Europe reached their highest levels of the war. Entire regions emptied in anticipation of approaching combat. One lesser-known operational detail is that many of these movements were directly triggered by military orders rather than spontaneous panic. Local authorities frequently instructed populations to evacuate without providing transport, food supplies, or destination planning, assuming that civilians would be absorbed elsewhere. In practice, this assumption proved fatal. Refugees faced extreme vulnerability. Winter conditions exposed families to hypothermia and exhaustion, particularly the elderly and children. Food scarcity was widespread, as rural areas could not support sudden population influxes and urban distribution systems had collapsed. Disease spread rapidly among displaced populations, living in overcrowded shelters, barns, or open fields. These deaths accumulated gradually and were rarely recorded in wartime statistics, masking their scale. Military operations further compounded the danger. Refugee columns often moved along the same roads required for troop movements, making them vulnerable to artillery fire and air attack. In several documented cases, civilian convoys were caught between advancing and retreating forces, suffering heavy casualties despite lacking any military function. Historians continue to debate whether these losses were an unavoidable byproduct of fluid warfare or the result of insufficient effort to separate civilian and military traffic. The psychological toll was equally severe. Displacement shattered family structures, eroded social cohesion, and eliminated informal support networks essential for survival. Many refugees died not in moments of violence, but weeks later from malnutrition, illness, or exposure, far from any battlefield. The refugee crisis illustrates how the war's final phase extended destruction beyond combat zones. Even where guns fell silent, the human consequences of mass movement and institutional collapse continued to kill. In this way, civilian displacement became one of the most lethal, yet least visible dimensions of World War II's closing months. Comparisons between different theaters of operation help explain why violence persisted at such extreme levels in the final months of World War II. While the war is often discussed in broad terms, conditions varied significantly across fronts, shaping how and why casualties accumulated. Differences in operational tempo, command culture, and civilian exposure produced distinct patterns of destruction, even as overall defeat became inevitable. A confirmed historical fact is that casualty rates during late 1944 and early 1945 remained high across all major theaters, despite differing strategic circumstances. One lesser-known operational detail is that in areas where advances were rapid, fighting was often more chaotic and lethal than in zones of slower methodical movement. Rapid breakthroughs disrupted command structures, leaving isolated units to fight independently, often to destruction, rather than withdraw in an organized manner. In Western and Central Europe, highly mechanized forces emphasized speed and deep penetration. This approach shortened campaigns but increased the risk of encirclement battles and sudden counterattacks. When resistance stiffened, attackers relied heavily on firepower to maintain momentum, producing concentrated bursts of destruction. Civilian populations, living amid dense infrastructure, were frequently caught in these rapid shifts, suffering from bombardment, displacement, and shortages with little warning. In contrast, other theaters experienced slower advances characterized by layered defenses and deliberate resistance. These conditions prolonged engagements and exposed both soldiers and civilians to sustained artillery fire and attritional fighting. Defensive doctrine emphasized holding ground at almost any cost, transforming towns and transport nodes into prolonged killing zones. Historians continue to debate whether slower operational tempo reduced overall casualties by limiting exposure or increased them by extending the duration of suffering. Across all fronts, a common feature emerged: the erosion of command coherence. As central authority weakened, local decisions increasingly determined outcomes. Some commanders chose to surrender or withdraw to preserve lives. Others fought until annihilated. This variability explains why casualty figures spiked unpredictably, even in regions far from decisive strategic objectives. Comparing fronts reveals that no single factor explains the war's late lethality. Instead, it was the interaction of operational style, geography, and institutional breakdown that sustained violence. Regardless of location, the final months of World War II remained deadly because systems designed for total war continued to function long after strategic purpose had faded. By the final months of World War II, the breakdown of command and communication had become a critical driver of unnecessary loss of life. As central authority eroded under military pressure, the ability of high commands to control events at the operational and tactical levels weakened dramatically. This fragmentation ensured that violence continued not because of coordinated strategy, but because of disconnected decisions made in isolation. A confirmed historical fact is that, by early 1945, many field formations operated with minimal or no direct contact with higher headquarters for extended periods. Communications infrastructure had been heavily damaged, radios were scarce or inoperable, and courier systems were disrupted by air attacks and rapid frontline shifts. One lesser-known operational detail is that some units continued fighting for days or weeks without accurate information about the broader strategic situation, including neighboring unit withdrawals or ceasefire negotiations occurring elsewhere. This lack of information distorted decision-making. Commanders often assumed that resistance was being maintained on their flanks and adjusted their actions accordingly, only to discover too late that they had been isolated. In such conditions, retreat frequently appeared more dangerous than holding position, as withdrawal routes were unclear or believed to be blocked. The result was a pattern of localized last stands that produced high casualties without contributing meaningfully to overall defense. On the opposing side, advancing forces also suffered from fragmented coordination. Rapid advances stretched command networks thin, increasing the likelihood of friendly fire incidents, misdirected artillery, and unsupported assaults. Units were sometimes ordered to seize objectives already abandoned or destroyed, exposing them to unnecessary risk. These errors were rarely the result of incompetence. They reflected the sheer speed and scale of operations occurring amid collapsing infrastructure. Historians continue to debate whether improved communication could have significantly reduced late-war casualties, or whether the pace and violence of total war made such breakdowns inevitable. What is clear is that as coherent command dissolved, the war became more lethal at the local level. Decisions affecting life and death were made with incomplete information, heightened fear, and little opportunity for correction. The breakdown of command and communication transformed the final phase of World War II into a series of disconnected, deadly episodes. Without effective control or shared situational awareness, the war persisted through inertia, ensuring that its conclusion was marked not by coordination, but by chaos. One of the most striking indicators of desperation in the final months of World War II was the expansion of combat participation to groups previously exempt from military service. As manpower reserves collapsed, authorities increasingly relied on adolescents and elderly men to fill defensive roles. This policy did little to alter the strategic situation, but significantly increased casualties during the war's closing phase. A confirmed historical fact is that by late 1944, Germany formally mobilized the Volkssturm, conscripting males outside traditional age limits for frontline service. These formations were intended to bolster local defense, but were often deployed directly against experienced and well-equipped opposing forces. One lesser-known operational detail is that many Volkssturm units received only minimal training, sometimes limited to a single day of weapons instruction, and were issued obsolete or mismatched equipment with inadequate ammunition. The military effectiveness of these formations was limited. Lacking training, cohesion, and command experience, they were poorly suited for coordinated defense. Nevertheless, orders frequently required them to hold fixed positions, such as road junctions or urban blocks, regardless of tactical feasibility. When confronted by mechanized or artillery-supported attacks, these units suffered extremely high casualty rates in short periods of time. Their presence on the battlefield increased the overall death toll without materially slowing advancing forces. The use of underage and elderly combatants also had psychological consequences. Regular soldiers, witnessing the deployment of civilians and minors, often interpreted it as evidence that leadership had abandoned realistic military planning. At the same time, ideological pressure portrayed participation as a civic duty, leaving individuals little room to refuse. Historians continue to debate whether such mobilization reflected genuine belief in defensive necessity or served primarily as a symbolic assertion of continued resistance. Civilians were further endangered by this policy. The arming of local populations blurred the distinction between combatant and non-combatant, exposing entire communities to retaliation and bombardment. Areas defended by improvised units were more likely to be subjected to heavy fire, increasing civilian casualties alongside military losses. The expansion of combat participation to children and the elderly underscores how the final months of World War II were sustained by desperation rather than strategy. By drawing ever wider segments of society into direct combat, authorities ensured that defeat, when it came, would exact a far greater human cost than military necessity required. Medical systems, already strained by years of continuous warfare, reached a point of near collapse during the final months of World War II. As casualty numbers surged and logistics disintegrated, the ability to treat wounded soldiers and civilians deteriorated sharply. This failure transformed survivable injuries into fatal ones, significantly increasing the war's death toll, even where combat intensity briefly declined. A confirmed historical fact is that by early 1945, frontline medical evacuation times in several European theaters had lengthened dramatically compared to earlier phases of the war. Field hospitals were frequently overrun by advances or forced to relocate under fire. One lesser-known operational detail is that medical units often lacked basic supplies, such as antiseptics, anesthetics, and blood plasma, forcing surgeons to triage aggressively and abandon cases that might previously have been saved. Winter conditions compounded these challenges. Wounded personnel exposed to cold suffered higher rates of shock and infection, while frozen ground complicated burial and sanitation, increasing the spread of disease. In some areas, medical staff were ordered to move with retreating units, leaving wounded soldiers behind with minimal care. These individuals often died hours or days later, deaths that occurred outside active combat, but were direct consequences of systemic failure. Civilian medical care fared even worse. Hospitals in urban areas had been damaged or destroyed by bombing, and remaining facilities lacked electricity, clean water, and trained staff. Doctors and nurses were exhausted, undernourished, and frequently displaced themselves. One documented pattern was the sharp rise in deaths from otherwise treatable conditions, such as pneumonia, infected wounds, and childbirth complications. These losses rarely appeared in military records, but were integral to the final mortality figures. Historians continue to debate whether medical collapse was an unavoidable outcome of total war or the result of strategic decisions that deprioritized care in favor of continued offensive operations. What is clear is that once medical systems failed, the relationship between injury and survival fundamentally changed. Being wounded late in the war was far more likely to result in death than earlier in the conflict. The breakdown of medical care illustrates how the war's final months remained deadly even beyond the battlefield. Violence destroyed not only bodies but the systems meant to preserve life, ensuring that the human cost of World War II continued to rise until its very end. Retreat and encirclement became defining features of the final months of World War II, producing some of the most catastrophic losses of the conflict. As front lines collapsed and mobility declined, withdrawing forces frequently found themselves cut off before organized disengagement could occur. These situations transformed retreats into annihilations, sharply increasing fatalities even as strategic defeat was already assured. A confirmed historical fact is that large numbers of formations were encircled and destroyed during late 1944 and early 1945 as advancing armies exploited speed, air superiority, and disrupted communications. Once surrounded, units often lacked sufficient supplies to sustain prolonged resistance. One lesser-known operational detail is that many encircled forces exhausted their ammunition within days, after which fighting continued with improvised weapons or sporadic local counterattacks that served no realistic military purpose. Encirclement created a brutal logic. Commanders feared that surrender would be interpreted as disloyalty or punished by their own authorities, while breakout attempts frequently resulted in mass casualties under concentrated fire. In some cases, fragmented groups attempted night withdrawals across open terrain, suffering devastating losses from artillery and small arms fire. These actions produced casualty spikes disproportionate to any operational gain. Civilians trapped within encircled areas faced equally dire conditions. Food stocks were rapidly consumed, medical care collapsed, and bombardment intensified as attackers sought to force rapid capitulation. Fires, disease, and starvation claimed lives long after organized resistance had ceased. Historians continue to debate whether quicker surrender in encircled zones could have meaningfully reduced civilian and military deaths, or whether ideological pressure and command fragmentation made such outcomes unrealistic. For advancing forces, encirclements were tactically efficient but ethically complex. Destroying surrounded formations reduced the risk of renewed resistance, but often required sustained firepower against isolated pockets, prolonging local violence. In several instances, fighting continued until no organized defenders remained, even when surrender signals were attempted amid chaos. The prevalence of retreat and encirclement illustrates how the war's final phase remained deadly through structural momentum. Once collapse began, it did not produce orderly disengagement, but cascades of destruction. The inability to withdraw safely ensured that defeat was experienced not as a controlled ending, but as a series of lethal compressions that consumed soldiers and civilians alike. The psychological strain on combatants reached its most severe levels during the final months of World War II, contributing directly to continued violence and elevated casualty rates. Years of sustained combat, combined with deteriorating living conditions and the collapse of clear strategic purpose, eroded judgment, discipline, and restraint on all sides. Mental exhaustion became a force multiplier for destruction. A confirmed historical fact is that rates of combat fatigue and psychological breakdown increased sharply during late 1944 and early 1945. Medical reports from the period describe growing numbers of soldiers unable to function effectively under fire. One lesser-known operational detail is that many armies shortened or eliminated rest rotations during this phase, believing that victory was near and that temporary strain was acceptable. In practice, this policy kept exhausted units in continuous combat, compounding stress and impairing decision-making. Under these conditions, small unit behavior changed. Soldiers were more likely to misinterpret movement as hostile intent, leading to increased firing and higher rates of accidental or unnecessary killings. Fear and anticipation replaced discipline as guiding instincts. Defensive units, convinced that capture meant death or punishment, often fought with heightened desperation, while attacking forces, frustrated by resistance they believed irrational, responded with overwhelming force. The psychological toll also reduced the capacity for restraint toward civilians. Exhausted troops were less inclined to distinguish between military necessity and collective punishment, particularly in urban or retreating environments where civilian presence complicated operations. Historians continue to debate whether late-war brutality stemmed more from ideological conditioning or from cumulative psychological collapse after years of sustained violence. The two factors were often inseparable. Commanders faced similar pressures. Decision-making at higher levels became increasingly rigid as leaders relied on familiar doctrines rather than adapting to deteriorating human conditions. Orders emphasized endurance and completion of objectives, even when unit cohesion had visibly degraded. This disconnect between expectations and reality increased the likelihood of catastrophic engagements. Psychological strain ensured that the war did not simply continue mechanically, it intensified in human terms. As mental resilience eroded, the capacity for measured action declined, and violence became more indiscriminate. In the final months of World War II, psychological exhaustion was not merely a consequence of fighting, it was a driver of continued lethality. The final battles in Europe underscore how World War II remained fiercely contested until its last days, despite the strategic inevitability of defeat. Rather than diminishing, combat operations in the war's closing weeks often intensified as advancing forces sought to eliminate remaining resistance and secure key political and administrative centers. These operations produced concentrated bursts of violence that added significantly to the final casualty totals. A confirmed historical fact is that some of the heaviest fighting in Europe occurred in March and April 1945, only weeks before formal surrender. Urban centers, transportation hubs, and river crossings became focal points for last-ditch defense. One lesser-known operational detail is that many of these battles were fought not to change the outcome of the war, but to shape the conditions under which occupation and surrender would occur. Local commanders believed that holding out, even briefly, might influence post-war treatment or administrative arrangements. Advancing forces faced a dilemma. Bypassing pockets of resistance risked leaving armed units behind supply lines, while direct assault required time and heavy firepower. The prevailing solution was to eliminate resistance decisively. Artillery barrages and close-quarters fighting became routine, particularly in cities where defenders used rubble and infrastructure to slow advances. These methods reduced friendly casualties in the long term, but produced immediate spikes in deaths among defenders and civilians alike. For defending troops, the final battles were marked by confusion and fragmentation. Orders were inconsistent or contradictory, and communication with higher command was often non-existent. Some units fought under outdated instructions, unaware that neighboring formations had surrendered or withdrawn. Historians continue to debate whether clearer surrender directives could have reduced late-war casualties, or whether the collapse of authority made coordinated cessation of hostilities impossible. Civilians trapped in these final battles experienced extreme danger. Evacuation was often impossible, and essential services had ceased to function. Fires, shortages, and exposure claimed lives even after fighting moved on. In several cases, civilian deaths continued for days following the end of organized resistance due to untreated injuries and lack of medical care. The final battles in Europe demonstrate that wars do not end evenly. Even when outcomes are certain, the mechanics of military operations can sustain intense violence. In World War II, the closing weeks were not a gradual winding down, but a compressed period of destruction that ensured the war's human cost continued to rise until the very end. The timing of surrender in World War II was shaped less by battlefield reality than by political fragmentation and fear of consequences. By the spring of 1945, the military situation in Europe had become untenable, yet formal capitulation was delayed by competing authorities, unclear succession, and uncertainty over how surrender would be received. This delay ensured that fighting continued long after organized resistance no longer served any strategic purpose. A confirmed historical fact is that after the death of Adolf Hitler in late April 1945, authority passed to Karl Dönitz, whose government pursued a piecemeal approach to surrender rather than immediate, comprehensive capitulation. One lesser-known operational detail is that this strategy aimed to allow as many troops and civilians as possible to move westward before hostilities ceased. While politically motivated, this approach prolonged fighting in several regions where local commanders received ambiguous or delayed instructions. Fragmentation at the top translated into confusion at the front. Some units were authorized to surrender, while others were ordered to continue fighting or receive no guidance at all. In the absence of clear, unified directives, commanders defaulted to resistance, fearing punishment for unauthorized capitulation. This uncertainty produced unnecessary engagements in the war's final days, including clashes that occurred mere hours before surrender orders were finally transmitted. Fear also played a decisive role. Many officials believed that unconditional surrender would result in severe reprisals, motivating them to delay formal capitulation in hopes of negotiating more favorable terms. Historians continue to debate whether these fears were rational assessments or ideological projections shaped by years of propaganda. Regardless, the effect was to extend hostilities at a moment when civilian and military losses were already at their peak. For civilians, delayed surrender meant continued exposure to bombardment, displacement, and deprivation. Infrastructure that might have been spared in a timely cessation of hostilities was instead destroyed in final engagements with no bearing on the war's outcome. Each additional day of fighting translated into hundreds or thousands of additional deaths. The late arrival of surrender illustrates that wars do not end automatically when defeat becomes clear. Political uncertainty, institutional collapse, and fear combined to slow the formal conclusion of World War II, ensuring that its final moments were among its most costly. Assessing the cost of the final months of World War II requires moving beyond aggregate casualty figures to understand how disproportionately lethal this period was. Although the war had already consumed millions of lives by mid-1944, the closing phase accounted for an extraordinary share of total deaths. This concentration of loss was not the result of a single factor, but of multiple destructive processes converging as the conflict unraveled. A confirmed historical fact is that in several European regions, casualty rates in early 1945 exceeded those of any earlier comparable period. These deaths included not only soldiers killed in combat, but civilians who died from bombardment, displacement, hunger, disease, and exposure. One lesser-known operational detail is that many late-war fatalities were never formally recorded as war casualties at all. Deaths in refugee columns, makeshift shelters, and collapsed hospitals often fell outside military accounting systems, understating the true scale of loss. The final months reveal how total war resists clean endings. Military institutions continued to function according to doctrines developed for decisive victory, even when such victory had already been secured. Ideology, discipline, and fear sustained resistance beyond strategic logic. At the same time, collapsing infrastructure ensured that even non-combat environments became lethal. Survival increasingly depended on chance rather than status, location, or intent. Historians continue to debate whether the final death toll could have been significantly reduced through earlier surrender, altered strategy, or greater flexibility at the command level. Some argue that the momentum of global war made such adjustments unrealistic. Others contend that political and institutional choices, rather than necessity, accounted for much of the late destruction. What remains clear is that inevitability did not translate into restraint. The cost of the final months lies not only in numbers, but in their character. These deaths occurred after outcomes were known, systems were failing, and alternatives, however limited, may have existed. The war's end was not a release from violence, but its final concentration. The final months of World War II demonstrate that the end of a war is often its most dangerous phase. Victory did not arrive as a moment of relief, but as a prolonged process shaped by institutional inertia, ideological rigidity, and collapsing human systems. Military operations continued at full intensity, while civilian life disintegrated under the weight of displacement, shortages, and fear. Together, these forces ensured that death remained pervasive even as defeat became unavoidable. This period challenges simplified narratives of war ending once outcomes are decided. Instead, it reveals how deeply violence can be embedded within structures designed for total conflict. Once mobilized, these structures prove difficult to dismantle quickly or safely. Decisions made earlier in the war constrained options at its end, narrowing the space for mercy, compromise, or control. The legacy of the war's final months lies in this lesson. Mass violence does not cease automatically with strategic clarity. It persists through systems, beliefs, and habits that outlive their purpose. Understanding why the last phase of World War II was so deadly is essential not to assign simple blame, but to recognize how wars actually conclude, unevenly, brutally, and often at their most destructive when they are already lost.